So I was playing this new bass on stage, and it kept detuning, and I kept tuning it and tuning it and tuning it. And finally, right, and we're playing like a nice mid-tempo country shuffle, and the headstock just busts off, and the strings and the bridge and the tailpiece and everything just make this huge thunk on the floor, and everything stops. And one guy starts going like this. I was like, yeah, so it had been repaired, and I hadn't really noticed the repair,
Nothing like the sarcastic slow clap for the bass disaster. That is one of many great stories you're going to hear today from our wonderful guest. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are talking today with Kevin Smith, who is currently playing bass with Willie Nelson's band. He's the first new band member in, I think, 30 years. And we talk about that and all the other things that Kevin has been up to. He's had an amazing, multifaceted career and is incredibly active in the Austin music scene. He's played on 3 Grammy-nominated projects, Willie And The Wheel in 2009, and then in 2017, the Cedar Creek Sessions, and Summertime by Willie Nelson, and that won a Grammy. So, very cool for that. He's playing on an Bohemian Upton travel bass. We talk about that. We talk strings. We talk about slap bass and Texas-style slap bass and the variances that you're going to find in there. Great conversation. Know you're going to love it. And I'd like to thank Eric Roy from Upton Bass for connecting me with Kevin. And Upton is a sponsor of this episode, as is D'Addario Strings. And by the way, Kevin uses D'Addario Strings as well. And I'd also like to thank Robertson and Sons Violins and the English Double Bass Book. More on all those fine folks later. But let's dig into this wonderful conversation with Kevin Smith. Hey, thanks for sending that playlist along. It's so fun to listen through, and that's like super helpful for me because I mean I've listened to you play before, but like I really appreciate doing that. I was listening to some of those breaks and yeah, very very cool. And I'm glad that Eric connected us. This will be a lot of fun.
Me too, man. I'm so enjoying the Upton. It's been kind of a revelation for me. I've never had that's not true. I've had brand new basses, but I've never had a carved top before.
What were you doing in terms of travel before that? Were you just bringing an upright in a regular case, or what did you do before the Upton?
Yeah, I was bringing just a regular plywood bass and putting it in a David Gage case, full size, and I put a Reunion Blues gig bag over the bass, and it fits great into those Gage cases. So it's really, I've been traveling like that for as long as I can remember, pretty much, and whenever I need to, and it's. The Reunion Blues and the David Gage just fit so nice. It's really been great. Yeah.
Well, having something a little lower profile in terms of the size, traveling, all of a sudden you start to feel a little more like a saxophone player or a guitarist or something. If you can get something in the travel case, it's got to make things easier.
I don't have a travel case yet. I haven't taken the neck off because all our stuff stays on a truck. So I've got the size David Gage case, and I got the bass maybe 2 months ago. So I haven't taken the neck off yet. I don't want to get into it until I have to.
Well, actually, that makes total sense that you would be trucking it because of just the amount of gear that you'd probably be bringing, right? Like that you don't fly anywhere with the bass. You're just loaded up on the truck.
Yeah. Everything goes on the truck, and we don't do any trips to Europe or anything like that. We've got 3 80-year-olds in the band. So, so we go up to Canada, and that's about all the international stuff we do.
That's the best way to travel of all, like not having to bring a bass at all. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's great. I'm very, very spoiled right now. This gig is they pay us well. There's only about 6 people on my bus, so we've got larger bunks. We travel. We fly out and meet the buses, and then do the tour and fly home, depending on where we're at. If we don't ride the bus in or out, it's really been this job has been a real blessing. I don't know that I'll ever have something this cool and this comfortable again.
Well, how, like, I'd love to hear, there's so many directions we can explore, but maybe can we just start maybe like, how did you get connected with Willie Nelson and your plan? You've been 3 Grammy nominated albums. You won a Grammy for one of them. Like, can we just start with the story of how you got connected?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been around Austin for a long time, and I've always played slap and studied slap stuff. I did a lot of rockabilly for many years, and after I did that, I wanted to learn a little bit more. So I studied some traditional jazz stuff, and I got way into the early Western swing stuff, which was specific to Texas. Bands like Milton Brown and his Brownies, and the really, really early acoustic stuff is what I really, really enjoyed. So in 2009, Ray Benson, who is the front man and leader of Asleep at the Wheel, and who's been, he's had me in and out of his studio for sessions for many, many years and likes what I do. He loves the traditional slap stuff. So they were going to do an album with Willie called Willie And The Wheel. And Jerry Wexler from Atlantic Records was a buddy of Ray's for a long time. So Jerry Wexler, this is a pretty cool story. Jerry Wexler calls up Ray Benson one day and says, "Hey, Ray, I got a big pile of Western swing albums. I'm just going to send them all to you." So Ray said, "Yeah, great, man, send them out." So Jerry Wexler had worked with Willie in the 70s on Atlantic. He gets all these records, and a lot of them are annotated with WN next to a song. So Ray calls Wexler and says, "So what's up with that?" And he said, "Well, when we had Willie on the label, I wanted to do a real traditional Western swing record with really old school songs." So Ray said, "Yeah, I'm going to do it right now," because at the time Wexler was getting fairly ill. So Ray decided he was going to do that. So he called me, and I ended up playing on a fair amount of the tracks on the record, which was great fun. And he said, "Well, it'd be great if you could do the tour with us." And I said, "Yeah, man, that would be excellent. I would love to do that, of course." And he said, "Well, if we're going to do it, you're going to have to learn, Willie's entire show, because when we get out there, he may do one Western swing song. He may do the whole album. We don't know. But you have to be prepared to do anything that's going to come off the top of his head." So I spent a couple months just really, really working hard on that stuff, trying to learn as much as I could and make sure that if he called something that I was ready for it. And the tour went really great, and we did an hour-long Austin City Limits. The 35th anniversary Austin City Limits show was Willie and the Wheel, which was, it's just, stellar to be able to go out on tour and then come home to your hometown and do a show with Willie and the Wheel was epic. And then a couple years later, and well, on that tour, I should mention that I met Mickey Raphael, who's played harmonica with Willie since the early 70s. So in late 2011, Willie's original bass player passed away, who had been with him since the late 60s. And, they tried a couple things that hadn't really worked out. So I got up one morning and there was a text from Mickey saying, give me a call. So I called him like 8 o'clock Saturday morning, and he said, "Well, if you want to come out and play a show tonight, we're playing out in Houston, and then we're heading east. So come out and play tonight, and if it goes well, you can just finish the run with us." So I said, "Great, let me call you right back." So I had 3 gigs that day I had to sub out. Got on the phone, got everything subbed out, and because the gig was out in East Texas, I called some more friends and said, "Hey, would you drive down with me and then drive the car home if I end up going on the bus?" So they emailed me a couple shows. I got in the car, and it's about a 3-4 hour drive, and I just listened to the show, and because it was such short notice, I didn't feel there could really be any real unrealistic expectations, So it was really easy to kind of zen out and go, well, I only know what I know, and I listened to this, so it'll be what it is. It's not going to be a big deal either way. So I drove out to Houston, and I get there, and I had some dinner, and I went into the dressing room to rehearse, and I had my headphones on and my electric bass, and at first they wanted only electric. So I'm sitting there playing my electric and, just going over stuff that I might not know. And these 2 kids come in, and they were, in their early 20s. I'm like, okay, cool. And they start kind of wrestling. Pretty soon, they're like rolling around on the floor, just really going at it. So I'm like, wow, okay, whatever. I'm focused. I'm staying in my zone, And I found out later those were Willie's kids, Lucas and Micah. So they just kind of wanted to see what I would do. Yeah. So anyhow, so I went out and did the show, and because I'd spent so much time learning all that material, it was still fairly current in the catalog, and we had it was so much fun, and it was so exciting. And Willie walked past me as he was leaving the stage and slapped me on the shoulder and said, "Way to go!" And I said, "Man, if that's all I get out of this deal, that's pretty rocking," because Willie's well respected down here. By everybody, especially here. So I kept the electric bass going, and I worked a lot every day learning songs. And every night he was throwing out new songs. Like, okay, I got 2 or 3 new songs that are going to come up, so I'm going to work on those. And about 4 days later, Paul English, who was doing most of the business then and who's been Willie's drummer since the 60s. He came in and said, well, you're on the payroll. And I said, all right, man, thank you. My kids are grateful. My wife is grateful. I'm grateful.
Back to our conversation in just a moment, but I'd like to thank D'Addario Strings. And yes, Kevin uses D'Addario Strings. They make wonderful strings. We're talking about Kaplan's this month. I've been using Kaplan's. I know Kevin's used Kaplan's. Brandino from Outkast and Black Eyed Peas uses Kaplan's. David Allen Moore in the LA Phil uses Kaplan's. So that's quite a diverse cast of bass players. They work great for classical playing. They were great with the bow. They were great for jazz playing and for bluegrass and for all kinds of styles. Check them out, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, D'Addario. And also, you've heard about them already on this episode, but I'd like to give a shout out to Upton Bass. You hear that Kevin's been using Upton, and it's working great for him and what he's doing with Willie Nelson. Lucia Torino of Devil Makes 3 uses an Upton travel bass. And Anthony Monzo had a restoration done by Upton. So whether you are playing with somebody like Willie Nelson, I don't know if there's anybody like Willie Nelson, but whether you're playing something on the road like that, touring all over the country or internationally, or whether you're looking for a new bass and you want to check out the Car model or the Bohemian or the Bostonian or many of Upton's other models that they continue to refine and develop, Upton has the bass and the solution for you. UptonBass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. All right, back to our conversation with Kevin Smith.
That's a wonderful story too. You know, like sometimes you look back at your career and you think, wow, everything sort of hinged on that one moment. But I can only imagine what it was like driving to East Texas, like listening to those songs. You got the arrangements with the car. It's like, well, I'm either going home or I'm getting on the bus and going on the tour. Wow.
And it was funny that month I had 3 different tours fall through. So I was looking at the month of January and there was nothing, just absolutely nothing. And I was thinking, well, I might want to consider getting some landscaping work or something, and here I am 6 years later. So it's been a great thing. And I'm still grateful for every show. And every night Willie will play something that you swear has never been played in the history of mankind. When he steps out on stage, he's really, I feel like he's really open to the universe and he's not thinking about what he's doing. He connects to the flow and it just goes. And there's never a set list. I know we're going to start with Whiskey River. We're most likely going to close with some gospel stuff, but not always. And everything in between is just totally up in the air. It's really exciting and fun.
What a cool way to make music and to have it be that sort of like different flow every night. It must change depending on the venue or the energy of the crowd or that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's kind of like a set rhythm to how the set goes. Sometimes it'll stay fairly the same. But it's very spontaneous. We did a show up at Sturgis. We did the Sturgis motorcycle rally a couple of years ago. And, as soon as we went out on stage, and now that at Sturgis, all the guys in the crowd have their motorcycles, so instead of applauding, they'll rev the motorcycles. So we're on stage and we did 2 or 3 songs and it was just constant revving, and you couldn't hear anything really. And so finally, I think after about 3 or 4 songs, Willie called out a Django tune that's really quiet, and I think he did that to try to bring him down a little bit. And it worked, so he definitely adjusts it and tries to steer it. But, you can't always predict where it goes, but it's always going somewhere fun.
Oh man, I could picture that right now. I'm from South Dakota, and I believe it or not, my middle name is Sturgis. Actually, Jason Sturgis Heath, and I have all these memories. I grew up in eastern South Dakota, but I remember right around August, like looking down at the interstate, and it was just like a sea of black leather jackets and bikes going west out to. And I've been out there a couple times myself. I don't ride, but I've been out there a couple times myself. And what a fascinating. Learning the crowd psychology to figure out how to bring the motorcycle revving down. That's like,
well, Willie's been around that crowd many times before. It's nothing new to him. I don't think there's anything new to Willie. He's done everything. He did, just about everything. So it's always fascinating. And the whole organization, most everybody who's been with him has been with him since the, 20, 30 years at least. I was the first new guy to join the band full time in 30 years. So, they have their own mechanism down, and it changes a little bit as our needs change. But, they've been doing it for so long, and they kind of invented this machine that didn't really exist, and there was no blueprint, So it's fascinating and enlightening to watch these guys do what they do. It's always great.
Wow. I mean, doing anything for 6 years, it seems like a while, but like if you think about they've all been together for 30 years, you're still kind of like a musical newcomer, right? Like
I will be the new guy for a long time.
Wow. Well, and so you're playing both electric and acoustic up there. Like, what's the mix look like for you?
It really depends. I mean, I always want to start the show on electric because we start with Whiskey River, and it's the sustain and the immediacy of the notes. When we come right out on stage, we like hitting that really hard and getting everybody's attention and getting everybody involved. And he'll usually move so fast through songs at the beginning of the set that I won't have a chance to change for 20 or 30 minutes. And what he'll do is he'll hand it over to Sister Bobby to play an instrumental. And she's got an intro on the instrumental, so then I have time to switch. So I try to get to it, as quick as I can. Sometimes it's 10 minutes in, sometimes it's an hour in. You never.
Well, I'm a huge like amateur slap bass fan. I love that, and I love the sound you're getting, and I just think it's such a cool. How can you just talk to me a little bit about that early Texas slap bass style? Like is that when I listen to like those early Elvis records, that didn't have any drums? I mean, is that at all the same, or is it a totally different thing? Like, just tell me a little about that style.
Well, to me, the more regional differences in slap bass, in the 30s through the 50s, I think Texas is so strong in that because there was so much dance music in Texas, and slap bass got used in all those different styles. It really, started out in New Orleans jazz as far as being part of American pop music. But then when you get into stuff like Ukulele Ike, who was very pop for the time, I'm not sure what year those was, but there's a song called Halfway to Heaven that has an amazing slap bass intro. And it sounds like it's something that might be actually written out. It's on the intro and the outro of the song. It's just great feel slap bass stuff. So it seems to me that the Southern stuff, and specifically the Texas stuff, is pretty laid back. It's about definitely more swings a little bit, especially once you get into rockabilly and Western swing and stuff. It's a little bit more lazy and a little bit more back behind the beat. The more Eastern, to me, the East Coast stuff or Northern stuff would be like Bill Haley's slap bass player, who was Marshall Lytle. And he was just ferocious, just really right on top of the beat, relentless. Those guys used to do gigs, like 8-hour gigs on the Steel Pier in New Jersey, and he had to slap the whole time without an amp. I mean, that's how he got his chops, So to me, that would be the difference, is the Southern stuff. And I think, there's theories about Southern music in general, but I think a lot of that has to do with the weather. If it's so hot, and so warm out, nobody's really crazy about getting up on their bass and jumping around and well, maybe I shouldn't say jumping around, but having a really heavy-handed attack. I think that was it. It was more swing influenced.
Yeah, fascinating. It makes sense, like the heat and just the contributing to like the sort of musical culture. That I never thought about that in terms of slap. That's interesting.
Yeah, I can't say that that's definitely the answer. It's my answer.
Yeah,
and there's. I say that I've studied it, and I have studied a lot, and I know a lot about it, but I also know that there's got to be somebody who knows a lot more than I do about it, So that's my opinion.
If I was going to put together like a playlist of some of your favorite slap bassists, like do you have any like 3, 4, 5 people that you'd point people towards just to sort of different styles?
Yeah, Marshall Lytle from Bill Haley and His Comets. Super heavy-handed, just great, just ferocious, just really driving the rhythm. So he would be one. Milt Hinton would definitely be up there because he's one of those guys who could do everything. He could play with the bow. He went through the Simandl method. Him and his buddies used to cut heads, like seeing how far they were in the Simandl book. And he played jazz. He played on a lot of pop sessions. So he's definitely one of my heroes. Willie Dixon another guy who pretty much did everything. He was a songwriter, a record producer, a singer, and an amazing slap player. And he was, he did these quadruplets that took me years to even get kind of a handle on. I'd try to do them and it wasn't really right, but something cool happened, so I'd leave it alone. There's a French guy named Nicolas Debuchet who finally worked that out, and I think it's on YouTube, the actual Willie Dixon quadruplet. So Willie Dixon is definitely up there. Guys like that. There's a bunch of other guys. There was a guy named James Kirkland who played with Ricky Nelson. Really great. Pretty aggressive stuff. I like slap stuff that's part of the arrangements where they'll do a specific rhythm that's based on slap and work that into a song. I think that's some of my favorite stuff. I like the stuff where the slap is just moving the song along and doing its thing. But when it becomes part of the arrangement, I like that stuff a lot too.
Yeah, totally. I'm thinking about those gigs, playing slap for hours and hours on end. I mean, how, and again, I'm such an amateur in this sort of, thing. I demonstrate slap to middle schoolers. That's about the most I do in the slap world. Does that demolish your right hand? How do you build up the chops to do that?
It's like running or something. Yeah. You just, the way I learned was I was playing in this drummerless rockabilly band. I met some guys down here in Austin. One of them who I moved down here from Denver with in a different band. And we wanted to do real traditional Sun Record style rockabilly with no drums. Mm-hmm. So once we started that band and we started getting shows, as always has been the case, I think in Texas, when you're playing a lot down here, you're going to play a lot of dance halls and play a lot of shuffle music for people to dance to and country and that kind of stuff. So, I was having to learn how to play for 4 nights, 4 hours a night, 4 or 5 nights a week. And if we weren't playing, we were rehearsing. So you just build up your strength. And I learned how to discern between pain that was actually hurting something long term and pain that was just, it's going to make a blister and it'll hurt less, And I learned how to take care of my blisters. If I got really bad blisters, I would take a needle and drain them through the healthy skin, go in and drain it and keep it drained. And eventually it would kind of re-adhere. And then you'd have just a monster callus that would last months. So trial and error and just staying on it all the time.
Well, that's a great tip. Those are the tips that people who aren't bass players might not understand, but that's a tip that can make someone get through a long night of heavy playing, whether it's jazz or slap or what style. I saw that you've experimented with a lot of different strings like labella and I saw Zyx, I think. How much does the string contribute to wear and tear on the hands? Did you find some that were easier on the hands than others?
Well, gut are always going to be easier on as far as the slap stuff goes, and also because you don't have to pull near as hard to get the string out away from the board. So guts, I think guts are preferable. Plenty of people slap on steel strings, and I do, because I tend to play more non-slap stuff, and for that I want good long notes and very clear, true intonation. But guts sound best. They feel best. I think that gut strings, when you're doing a lot of slap stuff, because they have kind of a swell to the note, you hit the note and it kind of swells out a little bit and dies off, or there's a little more decay to it. I think that I like the way that feels in music a lot. It feels like more old-timey to me. It feels like old rhythm and blues or jump blues or jazz than, that immediate hit that you get from a steel string.
Then, of course, you have all the challenges of depending on what type of a gut you're playing. And if you're traveling a lot and you're in Mississippi in the summer or something like that, and
that was the reason that I don't play guts right now, is that they just shred in the summer. And also I used to get the Kaplan Golden Spirals, which were the D&G. You could actually get a medium gauge instead of just one gauge. So they had a couple gauges, and it was a real thin nylon wind on a gut core. And those would last, even in Texas in the humidity. I was getting 8-9 months, sometimes more, out of a D&G string, and they sounded great, and they had a nice clean snap with that nylon winding. And they just quit making them, and I haven't found anything that really compares since.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're on the subject of gear, can you just maybe talk through the other gear you're using on, maybe on the road, and maybe even like in terms of electric too? People love hearing those kind of details.
Sure, yeah. On the upright, I'm using Eva Perastro strings, not the slap strings, but the all metal set. And I like those. Those have a nice warm gut sound up in the upper mid range. So I'm using those. I'm using the Upton Travel bass hybrid, a Bohemian hybrid, which is amazing. I've never had a carved bass, so I'm learning how to listen to a different kind of bass, which has been really exciting. I run straight out of, and I use their pickup, the Upton Bass pickup, and I run that into an Acoustic Image Flex preamp. Now that has 2 channels, and the reason I bought that, and you can also, it's modular, so you can take it and stick it into one of their cabinets and it serves as an amp. I bought it because I wanted to have something where I could run a pickup signal and a microphone signal both into the amp at the same time, and that does that really well. And I did that for a while, but I was just getting so much crowd noise and so much of Willie's guitar, which is pretty loud, blasting through that microphone, that it just added a lot of stuff that wasn't really contributing. But it was really cool to use the microphone. When you play, the difference between, your sustain and all that stuff is so different when you're playing amplified and non-amplified. But I found that with a mic, the feel was really similar to the way the bass feels acoustically. So it changed the sound and warmed up the sound, but it really changed the way it felt. It was really strange, but it really did. It just made it feel just like my bass and sound much more like my bass. But, it also had a lot of noise, so I'm not doing that right now. Okay. I'll get back to that. So, and I've used that. I go through there into an Ampeg amp. I use a 410 4-ohm cabinet, which is pretty powerful. I like the way that Ampeg tube amps sound, so I didn't want an SVT because it's just way too much power. So I got a V4B head instead, which is only about 100 watts. So that's really great at amplifying a smaller area. I think that as cool as the neodymium and Class D amps are these days, I feel like they're so efficient that they can really throw bass frequencies really far. And, that's not going to work very well as a stage monitor because you're a couple feet from your amp and it's taken the waves so long to sound that it just sounds different across the room than it does right next to it. So I feel like with less power and a little more speakers, I get a little more of a good feel to the bass. Electric, I use a Fender 62 reissue electric bass, which has been my bass for like 8 or 9 years. It's really good American-made reissue bass. I run that into a radial OD preamp, which is cool. I mean, ideally what you can do with those is you can run 2 electrics or 2 instruments in general into that, and then you can use an overdrive channel on that to overdrive your sound a little bit, which I don't do. I like a cleaner sound. So I'm using both of those, and I go straight into the Ampeg amp, and everything's pretty much straight up and down. I might boost the bass a little bit or play with the mids a little bit, depending on the room size or, the shape of the stage or whatever. But the Ampeg has been really versatile, making both instruments just sound really great. And the tubes, our front of house guy, I take the direct out of the back of the amp, and he loves the tube sound. It's really warm. And so it works out really well with what I'm doing.
I'd like to take a moment and thank our other sponsors for this episode, Robertson and Sons Violin Shop in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They have an outstanding, world-class, first-class selection of double basses. They've been serving the double bass community and the string community in general for over 4 decades. And they're huge supporters of the double bass community, different events, and big supporters of the International Society of Bassists. And so check out Robertson and Sons if you're looking for a new bass or a new bow, or you want to see some of the finest instruments that are on the market currently, or whether you're looking for a student instrument, your first instrument. They've got something to serve your needs. RobertsonViolins.com. And Our final sponsor for the episode is the English Double Bass Book. This is a new book coming out from George and Tom Martin of Martin Violins in the United Kingdom. This book is going to examine the great English double bass makers of the 18th and 19th century. It's got fine, detailed, beautiful photos of the work that was produced by these great artists during that real specific time period. We chatted with George and Tom earlier this year about this book. We're going to be going more in depth on it later, but you can pre-order your limited edition copy right now by visiting theenglishdoublebase.com. Okay, back to our final part of the conversation with Willie Nelson's bassist, Kevin Smith.
How did you get into bass in the first place? Was that your first instrument, or did you start on something else?
Kind of. I mean, I learned just really basically just a few guitar chords.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got into music when I was about 12 or 13, I had already listened to a lot of like old Elvis stuff, and I really liked old rock and roll and that kind of stuff. And then I discovered the Beatles and got way crazy into the Beatles. And then I started, through my friends and through, MTV and whatever in the mid 80s, I started seeing some punk rock stuff, and that was really exciting. So I got into the punk rock and rockabilly stuff. And, I goofed around with electric bass a little bit when I was in high school. I just nothing really stuck. So, but I always, listening to music, I always ended up kind of focusing on the bass to listen to where the melody was going and how it related to the structure. And it just, to me, it made more sense than anything else. So that's how I started really listening to bass. And I met some guys right after I got out of high school that had a rockabilly band whose bass player didn't show up for rehearsals. So I would play his bass at their rehearsals if he didn't show up, and I eventually joined that band, and that's really what got me going with electric bass. And then I realized that if I wanted to play the music that I really liked, traditional country and rockabilly stuff, that I was going to have to transition to upright. So I just jumped in and just did it.
And you mentioned that really getting in and studying slap bass, and then also you got really into jazz too, right? When did that happen?
But pretty heavily. I mean, as I started listening to the rockabilly stuff and kind of studying upright bass and specifically slap style, I started realizing that slap bass had been a part of so many forms of American music, like the jazz stuff. Mm-hmm. And Willie Dixon with the blues stuff, and then I started learning more about Texas music and started listening to some old conjunto stuff that had slap bass on it. So I kind of realized that, man, it's been around forever. It's not a mainstream popular technique, but it was one of those things that's just kind of been around forever. So for the longest time, anything that had slap bass in it, I would listen to and try to glean whatever I could from it. And I think that time really kind of shaped my musical tastes a lot for real traditional, maybe smaller band Western swing stuff. And I like small band stuff. I like more acoustic oriented stuff. So I think that's how I got into that.
How is it? And you mentioned that before Austin, were you in Denver? Is that what you'd said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you from the Colorado, or what is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Nevada, and met some guys that had a band, and I joined the band, and I did like maybe 2 gigs in Denver, and then we got booked down in Austin for a weekend at the Black Cat Lounge, and we went down to Austin and played, and it was just great fun, and beer and women and all that kind of stuff. And we went back to Denver, and it was just the same old thing, just not a whole lot going on. So we just, about 2 weeks later, we just threw everything in our cars and moved down to Austin.
Well, my father-in-law will love listening to our conversation. He's from Austin. My wife's from Austin, and my father-in-law was an electric bass player in all these bar bands in Austin. His like early '60s Fender, bass. You can see the groove worn down into the wood from all the. So you've been in Austin for a while, and I think Austin's like living here in San Francisco. Everything I hear is like. Everybody in the Bay Area is like throwing up their hands and moving to Austin. So like they're you could see the new houses popping up every day. Like, how has Austin changed since you've been there? Just in general or musically, or how's that place changed over the years?
I when I got here, And granted, this was in 1988. I was renting a 2-bedroom house for $250 a month. So, and I was splitting that with somebody. So, I was going out and playing gigs for, $40 a night, but doing that 6-7 nights a week.
Mm-hmm.
And I was making good money. And it really, like I said, I didn't really know how to play at all when I got down here. So there were a lot of bands coming up at that time that wanted upright players. And so I was just kind of in the right place at the right time. I got a lot of work in, and I learned on the job. There was a lot of on-the-job training. And through the years, the cost of living has gone up. There's many, many more people in town. The club business is still really great, but it doesn't really, the pay hasn't really gone up with the cost of living. So that's different. But I'll tell you, I think you can see more amazing, specifically roots musics on a Tuesday night in Austin than you'll get on a weekend night just about anywhere else in the world. Great players, great clubs, great dance scene here. So a lot of people are dancing to traditional country and swing and Western swing and all that stuff. So I love it here. I would hate to think that I would ever leave.
I love that Sturgis story so much with the motorcycles revving. And I'm mostly a classical musician. So like my best gig story is pretty lame. It's like, maybe like the concert started 5 minutes late or something. I don't know if I don't know if you've got any other like, either with Willie or in general, you've played so many places. Do you have any like memorable gig stories you like to share, either like positive or disastrous or otherwise?
One of my favorites is there was this band called the Paladins who were like my teenage heroes. That was the first guy I ever saw play a bass and an upright in a club. And so, I was hugely influenced by them, and they sounded so good. So we moved down to Austin, and we got a slot opening for him. So I was really nervous. I was going to play in front of my hero, Thomas Yearsley. And I had this new bass, and it was the first gig, and I wanted to try it out, so I brought both my basses, fortunately. So I was playing this new bass on stage, and it kept detuning, and I kept tuning it and tuning it and tuning it. And finally, right, and we're playing like a nice mid-tempo country shuffle, and the headstock just busts off. And the strings and the bridge and the tailpiece and everything just make this huge thunk on the floor. And everything stops. And one guy starts going like this. I was like, yeah. So it had been repaired, and I hadn't really noticed the repair. And,
Nothing like the sarcastic slow clap for the bass disaster.
And then another time we were going to England. We had been over once and didn't get the right work permits, but they let us through. So we told them next time we come, we got to have the work permits. We did a bunch of touring in Europe, and then we're going into England. We took a boat from Belgium to Dover, England. Got there, and they were like, well, what are you doing here? And of course, they sussed out that we were musicians. So they said, and we said, well, look, our promoter is right out there waiting for us. So go out and get him. And he came back, and we said, well, you got the permits, right? And he said, no, I don't have the permits. So they took us and took us to a holding cell. They took us to jail, took our belt loops and shoelaces and held us overnight and put us on the first boat back to Belgium the next morning. So we got held overnight and shipped back to the continent. Had a week off in Amsterdam with no money. We were busking for hamburgers.
What a cool! Well, I'm just such a fan of what you're up to, and I'm so glad that Eric, that you got connected with Upton, and that Eric put us in touch. I usually end with some sort of advice for young folks out there. Question: there are a lot of people in their teens and 20s, and it's usually something like, what advice would you give your younger self? And you could pick, either maybe moving to Austin, I don't know if you could pick the age, but any advice you might have for your younger self at any one of those career nexuses.
Yeah, I would find it hard to want to change too much because I feel like I've been so fortunate and I'm so happy and blessed with the job I've got now. So I would hate to change anything. I think I always could have worked a little bit harder, but, I had some great times too. So I wouldn't want to change too much.
There you have it, folks. My conversation with Kevin Smith. Kevin, thank you so much for chatting with me. And at the very beginning of the episode, you heard me talking with Kevin about a playlist that he put together for me of some of his work. I'm going to include a link to that playlist in the show notes for this episode so you can check out all of his playing. You know, he's playing on Grammy award-winning albums. I can't put that on the podcast without getting in all kinds of trouble. So, but you need to listen to Kevin. You probably have listened to Kevin in the past, even if you didn't realize it, but definitely check out that playlist. And thank you, Eric from Upton Bass, for connecting me to Kevin. Great to chat with you, Kevin. I'm a fan of what you do, and I can't wait to see what you continue to do in the future. And thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to these episodes, and time is such a precious resource. I am learning that lesson more and more every day. So I just am so honored that you would take the time and listen to this. And if there's one thing people ask, what can I do to help? This must be a ton of work. It is a ton of work, by the way. What can I do to help? The number one thing you can do to help is to share this. And you can share it by emailing it to a friend or a student or a colleague or whoever you think might be interested. And they don't need to be a bass player. The secret of this podcast, not really a secret, but I mean, bass is not the majority of what we're talking about here. We're talking about life. We're talking about getting better as artists. We're talking about lessons learned along the path. So while we are talking to bass players, it's not bass specific, right? So feel free to share with anybody that you think would be interested. And you can also share on social media the new water cooler that we all spend so much time, probably maybe too much time on. But if you want to share this on Facebook or on Twitter or wherever, that would be totally wonderful and appreciated as well. Reach out to me. Let me know if you have a guest idea or a topic idea. I put all of that into this spreadsheet and this list that I have, and I go through and I look at what people in the aggregate are interested in, and that helps me shape the direction of the show. So I would totally love hearing from you, and the best way to do that is feedback@contrabassconversations.com. If you're not on our email list, and we have many thousands of people on the email list at this point, but that's a great way to, I like to say, keep the conversation going between the episodes. So it'd be great to have you on that, and you can get on that at our website, contrabassconversations.com. That's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.